Several years ago, when Steve Chandler was working with psychotherapist Devers Brandon, she put him through her deathbed exercise. Steve was asked to clearly imagine himself lying on his own deathbed and to fully realize the feelings connected with dying and saying goodbye. Then she asked Steve to mentally invite the people in his life who were important to him to visit his bedside, one at a time. As Steve visualized each friend and relative coming in to visit him, he had to speak to them out loud. Steve had to say to them what he wanted them to know as he was dying. As he spoke to each person, Steve could feel his voice breaking. Somehow, he couldn't help breaking down. His eyes were filled with tears. Steve experienced such a sense of loss. It was not his own life he was mourning. It was the love he was losing. To be more exact, it was a communication of love that had never been there. During this difficult exercise, Steve really got to see how much he had left out of his life. How many wonderful feelings he had about his children, for example, that he had never explicitly expressed. At the end of the exercise, Steve was an emotional mess. He had rarely cried that hard in his life. But when those emotions cleared, a wonderful thing happened. Steve was clear. He knew what was really important and who really mattered to him. Steve understood for the first time what George Patton meant when he said, "Death can be more exciting than life." From that day on, Steve vowed not to leave anything to chance. He made up his mind never to leave anything unsaid. Steve wanted to live as if he might die any moment. The entire experience altered the way he related to people ever since. And the great point of the exercise wasn't lost on Steve. We don't have to wait until we're actually near death to receive these benefits of being mortal. We can create the experience anytime we want. A few years later, when Steve's mother lay dying in a hospital in Tucson, he rushed to her side to hold her hand and repeat to her all the love and gratitude he felt for who she had been for him. When she finally died, Steve's grieving was very intense but very short. In a matter of days, he felt that everything great about his mother had entered into him and would live there as a loving spirit forever. A year and a half before Steve's father's death, he began to send him letters and poems about his contribution to Steve's life. His father lived his last months and died in the grip of chronic illness, so communicating and getting through to him in person wasn't always easy. But Steve always felt good that his father had those letters and poems to read. Once, his father called after Steve had sent him a Father's Day poem, and he said, "Hey, I guess I wasn't such a bad father after all." Poet William Blake warned us about keeping our thoughts locked up until we die. When thought is closed in caves, he wrote, then love will show its roots in deepest hell. Pretending we aren't going to die is detrimental to our enjoyment of life. It is detrimental in the same way that it would be detrimental for a basketball player to pretend there was no end to the game he was playing. That player would reduce his intensity, adopt a lazy playing style, and of course end up not having any fun at all. Without an end, there is no game. Without being conscious of death, you can't be fully aware of the gift of life. Yet many of us, including Steve Chandler, keep pretending that our life's game will have no end. We keep planning to do great things someday when we feel like it. We assign our goals and dreams to that imaginary island in the sea that Dennis Waitley calls Someday I'll. We find ourselves saying, someday I'll do this, and someday I'll do that. Confronting our own death doesn't have to wait until we run out of life. In fact, being able to vividly imagine our last hours on our deathbed creates a paradoxical sensation. The feeling of being born all over again, the first step to fearless self-motivation. People living deeply, wrote poet and diarist Anais Nin, have no fear of death. And as Bob Dylan has sung, he who is not busy being born is busy dying.